So I want to start with a little story today. There was a person that I know that had told me a story about some coworkers that they had, and they were at work and they were overhearing a story that their coworkers, or a conversation rather, their coworkers were having. And the coworkers, they come from a background, a religious background that they believe that if they do this and this and this, that one day they themselves will actually become God or a God, right? So in the context of that, they were having this conversation kind of about the world around them and the things that they were seeing and kind of the chaos and all this stuff that's been going on. And she overheard one of the coworkers tell the other, when I become a God, I think I'll do things a little bit differently. I think I'll do things a little bit differently. Now, the terrible theology that's there and all the other things that are going on, I could spend many sermons talking about that, but that's not what we're going to get into today. What I want to talk about is what I believe is kind of a root issue there, aside from bad theology, but the fact of this, they were discontent in God. Right? They were not content. They were not satisfied in who God is. And that's what could compel somebody to make such a horrific statement such as that. So this idea of satisfaction in God is what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to be in going through the parables again, and we're going to be in Luke, the 7th chapter. And we'll be looking at verses 31 through 35. This is the parable of the children in the marketplace. You guys ever heard of that one before? I wasn't very familiar with it until Pastor Dean told me, I think you're going to do the children in the marketplace parable. And I was like, all right. So this is not a very well-known parable, but it is extremely important. And the more I started to study it and think on it, I started to think, man, this is something that when I would just read over and peruse through, I did myself a disservice by not stopping and thinking about what it is that Jesus is trying to convey to us in this parable. So a little bit of background, because we're going to enter into the text at the parable, but I want to set the stage for you. So Jesus is addressing a crowd, and just before he gets to this parable, we see that John the Baptist had sent a couple of his disciples. And they came to ask Jesus, are you the Messiah? Are you the one that we've been expecting, or should we expect someone else? And Jesus tells them all the things that he is doing. He said, just let the things that I'm doing bear witness for me, and you go tell John the things that are being done. Okay? And then he turns to the crowd and he starts to address the crowd, and he tells them how great John the Baptist is, that he is an apostle above apostles. And then he proceeds because he knows the crowd is divided. There are part in the crowd who believe John. They believe the message of John, that he was the forerunner that came before the Christ, the Messiah, which was Jesus. So part of these crowd that believed in John's message and were baptized by John, they believed in this Christ, that Jesus was the fulfillment of Scripture. But then you had others in the crowd, and Luke points them out as the Pharisees. Okay, the Pharisees and the lawyers, these people who were very well versed in the law of God, and they had rejected this message of John. They had rejected the fact that he was coming to proclaim that the Messiah would come after him, so they rejected Jesus as well. Because if they rejected the message of John, they had to reject Jesus. So Jesus addresses them in the parable that we are going to get into. And that's where we come to verse 31. And Jesus is talking to the crowd, and he says, to what then shall I compare this generation? What are they like? To what can I compare this generation? What are they like? Jesus says, they are like children sitting in a marketplace and calling out to one another. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not weep. That's the parable. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not weep. Jesus goes on to say, for John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say he has a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is justified by all of her children. So Jesus, he's talking about this illustration, this parable of children in the marketplace. And this would have been something that the people of that day were very familiar with. And that's why Jesus would have used it. He's painting a picture so that they can start to understand. And what Jesus is really saying here is you've got a picture of kids that are playing really these games of like wedding games and funeral games. Okay, because a flute, they're saying, we played this flute for you. Now, a flute was oftentimes played at a wedding. So when a flute was played, it was a joyous occasion. This is a time to celebrate, a time to dance, okay, a time to be rejoiceful. And they're saying, hey, we played this flute for you, and you didn't do what you were supposed to do. We played the flute, and you didn't dance. And then there's other children that are calling out and saying, well, we sang a dirge for you. Anybody know what a dirge is? Neither did I. It's a sad song. It's a song that is sung, a mournful song that's typically done at funerals. So on the other side of the spectrum, on one side you have rejoicing, happy. The other side you have sad, mournful song that is being sung. And they say, we sang this dirge for you, and you did not mourn. You did not cry. You didn't respond the way that we thought you should respond. So really what Jesus is doing here is he's revealing the hearts of the Pharisees. He's revealing the heart of those who would refuse to be satisfied in God, refuse to want to know Him. Okay, that's what he's saying. You guys, this generation, those who don't want to know me, you're like silly, bickering children. You're like kids that will never be satisfied. There's nothing that God could do or would do that you would be content in. You would be dissatisfied no matter what. Because John came, think about this. John was born in this world, right? He was from a sinful people. And God took him from birth and separated him and made him holy so that he was distinct from other people so that he could be this forerunner for Christ. And they said what? This guy's crazy. He must have a demon. You're not going to eat? You're not going to drink with us, John? Well, you must be crazy. And then the Son of Man came. Jesus came. The one that is holy. He is inherently holy. He is God in flesh. And He came to actually be within mankind. And He was eating and drinking and fellowshipping with those who are His. And they said, well, this guy's a glutton. He's a drunkard. Okay, this guy can't be the Messiah. He can't be the Christ. So Jesus is again pointing to the condition of their heart, that they would not be satisfied. They wouldn't be satisfied because these Pharisees, these religious leaders, they wanted all kinds of stuff, but they didn't want God. They didn't want God. They just wanted things that maybe they thought they could get from Him. Religion was nice. That's why they had fashioned this mold of what God was supposed to look like. But as soon as He started to leak outside of that mold, they rejected Him because they didn't want that God. They wanted the God that suited them really well. This God does a lot of good things for me. This God maybe brings me power or prestige or honor or money. I really like this God. I'll keep this God. And when the true God begins to reveal Himself, they want no part in that. So they reject Him. But see, I at first I didn't really understand this parable in the marketplace of these kids, because I don't see kids playing flutes and singing dirges. But I started to think, this is exactly like when I was a kid, and I'm sure the guys can relate with this a little bit more. But remember when you used to play like war games, or you'd play like cops and robbers, and you'd go around with your little cap guns, and they don't shoot anything, but they make a little sound. So you sneak up on somebody and you got to draw on them and you click, click, click. What is his responsibility? He's got to die, right? But there were always kids in the neighborhood who refused to die. They refused to die. Now, I'm not bitter at this at all. But then you get the, no, I shot you first. 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 And again, I think this is what Jesus is saying, that you're not going to be satisfied. You're like bickering children here. What Jesus is saying is that John did A, and they weren't satisfied. They wanted John to do B. And when Jesus came and he did B, they said, no, you should be doing A. So there was nothing that could have been done to satisfy these people who did not desire God. And the Pharisees, they wouldn't be satisfied in Jesus because they were like a lot of Israelites in that time, where they were expecting this political Jesus to come. Okay, this warrior conquering king that would come and he would give them freedom from Roman oppression. He would overthrow the Romans. He would establish the nation of Israel and the temple once again, and God would come and dwell with them, and things would come back to perfection. Now, Jesus is going to fulfill all those things, but they misinterpreted the scriptures. They misinterpreted, and they didn't know that Jesus was first coming not to bring war, but to bring peace. And to save and seek out the lost. But they were expecting, again, this mold that they had, that they wanted Jesus to fit perfectly into. And when he didn't, they wanted nothing to do with him. And I think about the justifications that we have and that people make in order to reject God. See, what the Pharisees did, because these were religious people, so I think they wouldn't just outwardly say, I'm going to reject God. What you have to do is you have to come up with excuses, rational reasons in your mind why you could never be satisfied in that God. And that makes it sit better with you when you reject him. See, and that's what the Pharisees did. They rationalized, no, John couldn't be who he says he is, so I can reject him. And Jesus couldn't be who he says he is, and they rationalized and they made it up in their mind that this person was false, and that's why they couldn't follow him. It's this justification that people do. They justify in their minds why they cannot follow after God. And I think a way that people do it so often here and now is, have you ever heard somebody say, well, I can't believe in that God because he only made one way to himself. Like, you're telling me that this Jesus guy is the only way, he's the only truth, he's the only life. It's only through him that we can come back to the Father. That is so ignorant of you. So you're saying all those people that don't know Jesus, they're just going to die? And people get angry when you tell them, like, no, you don't understand. Jesus is the way. Well, I can't believe in a God like that. I can't believe in a God that would only give us one way. They justify and they rationalize it in their mind so it sits better with them when they ultimately reject God. But it's crazy. It really is out there when we start to think about it. Like, there was a time when my brother and I had gone with my parents and we went camping. And my brother and I went walking around and we were just messing around and stuff, and we went wandering out into the forest area. And for a little while we were just playing. We're kids, so we got our heads in the clouds and we're just messing around. And then after a little while, we came to the realization that we had no idea where we were. That we were hopelessly lost. And like, I don't know if you've ever been lost in the woods, but there is like a panic that sets in when all of a sudden you realize, like, I have no idea where I am or how to get back. And we started panicking and we started like looking for the way back, and we'd see like a ridge line and we said, yeah, those trees kind of look familiar. I think that's it. And we'd run over to that ridge line and we get to the top only to find out that it's just more and more forest. More trees, more hills, and everything starts to look the same. And the more you come to this realization that I am hopelessly lost, that anxiety starts to set in. And we were looking for our way back and looking for our way back. And I remember I was probably like 5 or 6 years old, and I still remember this pretty clearly. And we were praying that God would bring us back to the path that we had come out into the woods on. And we kept walking and searching, and eventually we came back to that path. There was a section that we remembered, that we were familiar with, and we knew that would lead us back to camp. So we got on it and we sprinted back to camp. We were so excited. But could you imagine if we came up to that path and we said, there's probably another way. There's probably another way over here, right? Well, maybe I know that way leads back to camp, but that's a pretty big hill, and I'm kind of tired. I don't want to walk up it. So I'll look for a way around. It would be ridiculous for somebody to say, God, like, I'm hopelessly lost, and I see that you've given me a path, but only one path? There's only one? See, and it reveals a heart condition. It doesn't matter for so many people if God gave us one way back to himself or a million ways back to himself. Why? Because people don't want what's at the end of that path if at the end of that path it's God. We have to realize that some people will never desire God. They don't want to be satisfied in God because they're satisfied with themselves kind of being their own God. Right? So they don't want it. That's why John tells us in John 3:20, he says that, Jesus is the light, and the light has come in, but people don't want the light. People run from the light because they're afraid that what? The light will expose their deeds. And I think that there's two parts to that exposing of deeds. Where I always thought about, people run away because it's scary. If your deeds are exposed, like you think about closet or skeletons that you may have in your closet, you don't want those deeds to be exposed because there's shame there and there's embarrassment there. And I definitely think that's one part, but I think that there's another part where if you go into the light and your deeds are exposed, then you have to come to terms with them. Where people flee from the light because they don't want to be confronted with their own deeds. We love to live in willful ignorance. That's why you can talk to people about the Lord and they say, I don't want to hear anything about that. I just don't want to be confronted with a God that I might have to be accountable to because I don't really care about God. I don't think about God. But at the end of the day, if there is a God, if he really does exist, when I die, I'll probably go to heaven because I'm kind of a good person. It's willful ignorance. So many people love to not be confronted with sin because they don't want to have to deal with that sin. Because if they have to be accountable to God, that means that they're not God. And I think this is an important point that we as a church have to come to terms with, this fact that some people do not want God. They do not want to be satisfied in him. And the reason why I want us to understand this is we have to be careful not to do what a lot of churches have done. And that is try to orchestrate all the things that they do around a people that do not desire God. Now, we want to pray for those people, and we ultimately know that God can bring hearts back into right relationship with himself. There's no one too callous that God cannot break down the boundaries of their heart and bring them into right relationship. But we cannot start to say, all right, they don't desire God, so what we're going to do is I'm going to fulfill something that they do desire. I'm going to fulfill, I know a lot of people desire to be entertained, so I'm going to satisfy that. I'm going to satisfy that sweet tooth of entertainment. I'm going to satisfy, I know a lot of people like their kids to have great programs, so I'm going to satisfy that. Or I'm going to satisfy the type of music. I'm going to satisfy all of these things that maybe people are looking for, but at the same time, if they are not looking for God, there's no gimmicks and there's no other things that we can do to draw them into right relationship with him. So what we have to do is we got to get away from gimmicks and we have to get back on our knees, the place where real work is done, where we start to pray earnestly for a lost and dying people. There's so many of the parables we've been teaching on are people that do not hear. They have ears, but they cannot hear. They have eyes, but they cannot see. And we need to be praying for them that God would break down those boundaries and that he would allow them to hear and see, that he would cause them and stir them to want to seek God out in satisfaction in him. Now, I think that for Christians, This satisfaction in God is something that we have to come to terms with, because there are times that we aren't satisfied. And I think that what we have to get back to understanding is where our satisfaction in God comes from. And ultimately, that satisfaction that we have in God has to be rooted in who He is. It has to be rooted in His promises. It has to be rooted in what we know we will become because of what He has done for us through Christ. Okay, because if we base the satisfaction that we have on God around whether or not we're satisfied in present circumstances, that is constantly going to be shifting and constantly be changing. But I think that's what a lot of people do is, if I'm satisfied here, then I'm ultimately satisfied with God. I'm pretty okay with His plan because I'm satisfied here. But when things happen and they're not satisfied in the way that things are going, that ultimately affects their satisfaction in who God is. So our satisfaction in God has to rest in something so much greater than the fickle circumstances that we have here and now. It cannot be based on circumstance. It must be based on who God is. And the reason this is important is because, let's be honest, we go through seasons of life where we aren't satisfied. We're not satisfied in different things that we experience in life. I mean, sometimes if we're honest with ourselves, I think about my pursuit after the Lord, and I'm not satisfied because I think, why is it so hard for me to pick up my Bible and read it like I know I should? Like intellectually, I understand that I should be in the Word of God more. And if I did, it would radically continue to transform my life. But it's a struggle for me. And why is it that it's so hard sometimes to go to the Lord in prayer and spend significant times in prayer with Him? Sometimes I'm not satisfied when I think about this nature that makes me want to rebel against God more than I want to come and please Him. And I'm not satisfied in these things. I'm not satisfied when I think about the lost ones that I love dearly. And when I think that if they die without crying out to God, that they will spend an eternity apart from Him. Like that, I'm not satisfied in that. But is satisfaction something that we should always have? I think ultimately for God, yes, because it's rooted in something greater. But here there's times that you won't be satisfied. I think about John, right? John the Baptist. Do you think he was always satisfied in his ministry? When I think about the apostles, do you think that they were just always satisfied? I mean, in the context of this verse, John the Baptist had just sent his disciples to Jesus because he's in prison. He's in prison at this point. So he sends his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the Messiah? John knew that Jesus was the Messiah. He knew Jesus was the Messiah. But in that time when he's sitting in a prison cell, he's got this dissatisfaction and maybe this doubt, and he sends his disciples to say, are you the Messiah, or should we expect someone else? But I think with the apostles, can you imagine when they were also maybe thinking that Jesus was coming to fulfill Scripture in a way that He was going to be this political leader and overthrow Rome, and then they see Jesus, this Messiah that they had invested so much in, being nailed to a cross. And before the resurrection, do you think that they were satisfied? I think that they were terrified, and they were confused about what was going on. And the reason I bring these things up is because I think as Christians, we have to understand that there's seasons of life that we go through that it is okay not to be okay. It's okay not to be okay. We don't have to put on a mask and come here on Sundays and pretend like everything is always all right. And we do that. I think the biggest lie that's ever told in churches is the lie that, yeah, I'm doing fine. How are you doing today? Oh, I'm great. How are you doing? I'm fine. That's all you ever hear, because we don't actually get into the nitty-gritty things and say, you know what, I'm struggling. I'm not satisfied in the things that I'm going through. I'm not satisfied in where I'm at in life and what God is doing. And when we do that, when we admit that, it gives us an opportunity to gather around each other and come full circle back to what our satisfaction in God is actually rooted in. But when we put on those masks and we pretend all the time, it never gives us that opportunity for growth. And I think of a person that shared a story with me about this time of really, I would imagine, dissatisfaction in maybe the plan that God had at that moment. And they are wrestling with God on behalf of the salvation of their kids. And I'm pretty sure if you have children that are not walking with the Lord, you've probably been there, where you're wrestling with God. How could you be satisfied when you think that if your children died, they would spend an eternity apart from Him? So you are wrestling with God. And this person tells the story that in that moment, when they had been wrestling on behalf of their children with God, God clearly spoke to them and put this word upon their heart. And God said, even if I don't save your children, will you still follow me? And their answer to that was yes. But see, they had to come full circle. They had to go through that time. And there's the difference, guys, is that even when these things happen in our life where we're not completely satisfied, we still follow God. We still trust in God. We still believe in Him. When we create this mold for God, that I promise you, whatever mold you have created for God, He's not going to fit in it. I promise you, He's going to start to break out of it and you're going to be confused. But wait, I thought that God was supposed to look like this. And He's going to start to break out. And will you trust Him anyway in those times? See, when you think in your life, okay, I did this, and if I do this, God will do this. If I do this, God is bound to do this. And when He doesn't do it, will you follow Him anyway? Will you understand that He alone is God? And guess what? We're not. You're not. Only He is sovereign. Only He has the big picture in mind. And only He knows really what is best for you. So will you not do what the Pharisees did when you find yourself in a season of life where you are confused, you don't understand why things are going the way that they are, maybe you never envisioned your life being the way that it is. And in that time, will you not do what the Pharisees did, and that is make up excuses and rationalize in your mind and make yourself feel better about rejecting the God of the universe altogether? Or will you do what I pray you will do? And that is when you find yourself being confused or being lost, being scared, you will trust Him anyway. You will not base your satisfaction of God on temporal earthly things, but you will ultimately base your satisfaction of God on who He is and on His promises. The fact that He sent Jesus to die for you. And you know who you are, that you are wretched, that you deserve to spend an eternity apart from Him, but He has designed a path for you to come back to Himself. And it's all by His power and by His grace. And in those times, will you look to those promises of God? Because if you do, it doesn't matter the things that you go through here and now. I promise you, you will be able to find satisfaction in Him.